Hi, everyone. Welcome back to One Finance World. As we delve into the realm of finance and fintech over these next couple of days, we've been exploring and learning and sharing insights that hopefully will shape the industry's future. Our conference serves as a global platform where we have pioneers, thought leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs all coming together. The knowledge exchanged and hoped for relationships forged will undoubtedly help shape our finance landscape here. We are next joined here by our next speaker, Hemant Sethi. He is the founder and CEO of Zero Circle, and he's joining us this morning from New Jersey. And Hemant's discussion is going to be on the future of green finance. So Hemant, welcome to One Finance World. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Good to see
you.
Good
morning. Nice to see you as well.
Let me hand it off over to you to get started, and I will join you on the backside, okay?
Sure. Perfect. Sounds good. Share my screen here. Okay. Let me know if we can see my screen.
All set.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm looking forward to this great discussion here. So I'm going to be talking about green financing today. It's a subset of the overall kind of financing landscape. And there's a lot of interesting nuances and takes, specifically, focused on green financing and sustainable financing. And I want to kind of just, spend a few minutes with all of us on this topic. And if there's any questions, please feel free to reach me. So I want to start off with, with this quote from Larry Fink. This is an interesting thing that he said in the 2022 letter to the CEOs, the annual letter he does every year. And he basically states that every company in pretty much every industry has to be transformed to meet the net zero world, to meet the transition towards a net zero world in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Doesn't matter what time frame, you have to transition, right? Our current business practices, our current approaches to supply chain, manufacturing, does not really work for the new world. And because of this transition, all of us have to be thinking collectively of how are we going to meet this transition. The second statement to this is really, are you going to be a leader or are you going to be a follower, right? That was his key takeaway from this is, all of us have to lead this transition, and it's going to take a collective effort across the entire ecosystem to actually make this transition work, right? And there's a lot of commitments that have been kind of being published right now by various companies in annual reports and filings and things like that. One of the trackers, the database is called the Carbon Data Project, the CDP. They have a questionnaire and disclosure database of about 18,000 companies. But in the most recent report or survey that they did, only 1 in 5 companies really have a plan, right? Which is not good, right? All of us are saying yes. All of us see this noise in the statement about yes, we're all going to be carbon neutral by 2030, X, Y, Z. But when it comes to actions, there really is very limited plans on these, right? In addition to that, less than 1% of the companies actually have a credible plan, right? So once you get dive into the details of these, there's not really some credibility into what they're actually stating. So this is a problem. This is a real problem, right? And then on the right, there's this tracker that's been tracking our commitments across the ecosystem and where we think the emissions are going to be. It's based on science and evidence that there are all these scientists have been trying to figure out what actually could happen. I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity here for sure, but it doesn't matter what the actual number is. But just looking at some of the details here, the numbers don't look great, right? Based on the pledge and commitments as of now, we are looking at a 2% increase when the Paris Agreement states we are supposed to be 1.5% increase from where we're supposed to be, right? But that is, assuming all of these plans work, which, as you can see, they don't really have some credible plans. But then the most optimistic scenario is about a 1.8 on average, right? So, we need to start moving, right? We need to start moving quickly and aggressively. And that's, I think, the challenge in terms of where we are. There has been significant progress, no doubt, right? I think there's many companies, industries, governments that are trying to make significant progress in these areas. Over the last couple of years, there's almost $2 trillion in green bonds and financing that have been issued. Some of it was COVID related in the last 2 years, where there was a number of these social bonds that were kind of created for supporting the ecosystem within, that was kind of affected by the pandemic. But even with that constraint, there's significant amount of investment coming, and governments are starting to realize, right? Everybody's heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion committed. Europe is going through a similar process where they're looking to commit about $270 billion. UK just did a green bond of $53 billion. And there's a lot of others that are coming up in the kind of legislative and organization bodies between India, China, and other parts of the world. So action is happening, right? So it's not like the action is not happening, but we don't have a lot of time, right? That's the big issue right now. And we still have a long way to go. Based on a recent report from McKinsey, the expectation is if we want to achieve our 2050 net zero goals, we need to be spending close to $3.5 trillion in new spending every year. So that is translating to somewhere in the range of $250 to $275 trillion in overall spend for the next 30 years. That's massive. That's huge, right? In addition to that, as you can see by this chart, right, based on where we are in the current spend rate, we are nowhere near where we need to be to achieve some of our goals. So we still have a long way to go. And, the way I look at it is personally is financing is the spark that is going to drive this. And that's why I want to kind of touch on that a little bit is, green financing, specifically around, green financing is really going to be the spark that enables a lot of these activities and enables the both from an organizational growth as well as environmental sustainability. And that's kind of basically touching on this point, right? This spark is going to allow us to grow, like all financing decisions and financing needs. You are going to finance a company to grow the company. That's part of built into the process. But what is slightly different is now every financing decision has an environmental component to it. And the more and more we start incorporating environmental components into financing decisions, the better it is for the long term. And there's significant amount of capital being deployed right now across all spectrums, both, I would say traditional industries and kind of these clean tech and sustainable industries in the future. But I think eventually all of this capital will have to be transformed into some way of sustainable focused capital in the long run. Now, just a quick definition, right? What is green finance? It's any kind of instrument, investments, funds, bonds, equity, loans, etc., that is applied to environmentally sound projects and that can enable organizations to transform to the green economy, to transition them to a low carbon, inclusive, sustainable organization, right? Just by way of examples, you talk about, ESG derivatives, you talk about renewable energy credits, mortgages, all of these could potentially be applied to some form of a green focused transition, right? Whether it's environmental activities, solar panel installations, clean technology, regenerative agriculture, there's a number of initiatives, right? And there's, technology exists today. We still don't have the operational muscle and operational oversight to essentially execute on some of the technologies that we can kind of put into practice today, right? We might be waiting for nuclear fusion that might eventually solve this, but that is like, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. We don't really know. But what we can do today is focus on things that we can control, right? We can control solar and wind energy. We can control, fuel efficient type of fuel sources. We can control, operational efficiencies in certain types of process and manufacturing programs. So there's a lot of ways we can do this today without having to wait for some cutting edge technology that's eventually going to come. But, we don't need to wait for that to solve some of the problems we can essentially address today. Right. One thing I wanted to kind of touch upon a little bit is the definition of green finance, right? The people talk about it in slightly different ways: climate finance, green finance, sustainable finance. I mean, for the most part, there's a little bit of overlap in terms of all of that. As you can see, a typical ESG, and they've kind of added in the economic factor here, which is more about workforce development, local community development, etc. If you add all of these factors together, this is a good, very simple way to describe how to define green finance, broadly speaking. So you got on the left, carbon mitigation and climate mitigation, which is around low carbon financing. Then anything related to climate is, climate migration and climate mitigation, climate adaptation is focused on called climate financing. Now, if we include all the other factors around biodiversity, agriculture, soil, anything environmental related starts to become environmental green financing. Socio-environmental is, things related to healthcare, workplace, displacement. So those kinds of things starts to become social issues. So there's, women businesses, for example, right? Those are a bunch of things that current financing instruments do, kind of try to address. So they become social environmental. And then you look at the broad spectrum of anything you're trying to do, that is focused on sustainable activities is called sustainable financing, right? It doesn't matter what we call it, right? But at the end of the day, we're driving to three primary outcomes. We want to drive economic growth, which means that any kind of financing decision has to come within an ROI, right? If you're not doing an ROI, there's no reason to finance it, right? So that's a primary objective. It doesn't matter whether it's green or traditional. You don't finance something if you're not going to drive growth. But you also want to create a resilient environment, which means that you can start to, focus on these additional factors that are supposed to support your environmental causes and environmental needs. And different financing requirements could meet different criteria, right? You could be focused just on solar installation, or you could be focused on women empowerment, or you could be focused on developing countries. So it depends on what kind of, what your investors are looking for and what kind of theses your instrument is trying to address. But you could address one of those many environmental requirements or sustainable requirements you're looking for. But the last piece is, which, is kind of, implied, but not necessarily directly correlated right now because we don't have sufficient data, is in the long run, it is going to reduce risk, right? If you use less resources, if you optimize your resources, if you, streamline the operations, you are eventually going to reduce risk, right? And so that is a big part of, supporting some of these financing decisions. Now, there is a gaps in terms of quantifying it and things like that. But in the long run, every kind of, research paper, things that you read talks about, it is a sound business practice to do these kinds of decisions because they will eventually reduce risk in the long run. And then, you get the best of both worlds, right? So I'm going to touch upon a little bit why is it important, right? There's a number of different factors here. We'll kind of go through one by one a little bit and, touch upon some of them. So first is environmental protection, right? We kind of touched upon that already. A primary need for green financing is around protecting the environment, making sure, we and our, children and our grandchildren have a clean, healthy, equitable place to live. Then it's about making sure that you are developing processes and programs and practices that can make your organization sustainable long run, right? All of us today are getting impacted by severe, once in a generation events that's happening pretty much every year. And, you cannot grow a community, you cannot grow a business if you get these severe impacts every single year, right? So we need to be able to create a more sustainable process, sustainable ecosystem. And that starts with building the right practices, from the ground up. Economic growth, again, there's no growth, while you're financing. Risk management, we touched upon that a little bit. Attracting investment. So this is interesting, right? Because we're starting to see a new generation of, people entering the workforce that is focused on mission. They're focused on trying to drive, engagement causes and things like that before they, find a place to work, put their money to work, et cetera, et cetera. And that, while it applies to a generational shift, it also applies to many investors that you are trying to source, funding from, right? Whether it's banks or governments or region, et cetera. And you can attract, new kinds of investors that are looking to finance these kinds of projects. And that's interesting. I'm seeing a lot of growth in this area. A lot of companies are trying to tap into that market, both from a consumer lens and a business lens. You can start to see this evolve over time into something that becomes a much more material. That if my investors are asking for green investments, then I need to be able to finance green projects. And then, at the end of the day, it's going to affect your brand, right? Everybody's looking for, the right brand value that you want to communicate to your audience, to your customers, to your investors, et cetera. And the more and more you can say that, we are working with, interesting projects, whether it's in Africa or whether it's a wind farm out of the coast of Atlantic, doesn't matter. It will start to affect your brand in a positive way. we still have a long way to go. Most companies are not doing this, right? The large companies are currently doing some versions of these, but the projects, they take time. These are resource intensive, time intensive, and some of the returns take a long period of time to show returns. So this is something that I think will, you can get some short-term benefit by focusing on the brand value by doing some of these initiatives. And then compliance. I mean, this is a whole topic on its own, right? More and more governments are going to require organizations to start, being compliant with various regulatory requirements, not just from like today, banks have to look at KYC, they have to look at, credit, they have to look at various, regulatory compliance requirements already as part of any financing requirement. But now you're going to start adding in ESG factors on top of that as well, right? What is the carbon emissions? What is their supply chain looks like? And all of those are eventually going to come down the pipe. And some of them are much more ahead in parts of Europe than in the US. But the writing is on the wall. It is going to happen. And the more we can be on top of it today, the better it is for us to kind of meet some of these future compliance requirements where we may not have a lot of time to meet it, once it's passed into law. And then long-term value, right? If you're a sustainable organization, if you're focused on growth, if you're focused on operations, focused on efficiency, it is a recipe for you to have long-term value within the company, right? Now, the challenge is scaling this, right? You can do these one-off projects today and, kind of financing let's say $100 million solar farm, for example, right? You can do that today, or you can finance, maybe installing solar roofs by doing subsidies and things like that. But how do you scale this across the board, right? And that's where some of the challenges currently exist. There's no universal standard, and there's a lot of subjectivity in some of the data and the information. And so there's the banks and the institutions are left holding the bag to figure out what they want to do. And this is where I think some of the challenges start to come in. And there's a couple of innovations that are happening in this area that could help with these processes. But on the left side, these are the large initiatives. Think about the $100 million solar farm you're installing, right? While they say that it's going to reduce energy consumption, not use only renewable energy, etc. Until they're installed and measured and put into operations, you're not really going to see that effect for a couple of years, right? And we're starting to see some of the effects of some work that was done maybe 5-10 years ago, right? But these things take time to measure. But on the right side are your microfinance operations, right? You're supporting a farmer or a local business to be able to finance their operation. And it's tangible, it's quick, you can see the benefit, but you cannot scale that. So this pendulum needs to kind of balance a little bit better, again, with technology, with some regulations, with some standardization. And that balance will enable us to kind of both activate a lot more of these high value deals and also scale to a lot of the kind of the lower dollars and transactional volume that you can now start to finance and start to see the benefit of this the long term. Okay, there are still challenges though, right? If it was easy, it would have been done. Investors still look at short-term perspective, right? Every company has to go through investors. They are still looking at short-term horizons. If you have the right kind of management team or investment or board of directors that can look at a longer-term horizon and invest in the right capabilities and thinking and strategy for the long term, these things could work. But at the end of the day, short term still rules, and we have to kind of balance the short term versus the long term. In addition to that, cost is still an issue, right? A lot of the current practices have been sufficiently optimized to be the lowest cost possible. Now, if we start to doing some of these more interesting, renewable energy or recycled products, the cost is more expensive in general. So who's going to bear the foot of that cost? It's not going to be easy to do that overnight. It's going to take some time to do that. There is still an element of coordination between the organization. The finance, the CFO may not necessarily be completely lined up with the chief sustainability officer in terms of what the objectives are. And so there needs to be some internal collaboration and internal cooperation to align on the same goals. And this comes from the top, right? The CEO has to set the mandate in terms of how they want to move towards a more sustainable future. And that mandate has to be addressed by the various organizations. So the same thing happens in the bank, right? The loan issuer is not necessarily focused on sustainable activities because it's not a practice today. So these things will require some organizational change that is going to happen over time. The regulatory landscape is all over the map right now, right? It's constantly changing. I hear a new buzzword or an acronym every other day, and I think governments are trying to be overly aggressive. And as you are, working in a large, international corporation, you're going to have to deal with local nuances in different parts of the world, and that again is not easy for a small or mid-sized company to deal with. There's a ton of data gaps, right? There's no standard unified, data repository and even a framework of structure that people can understand and, universally agree upon. And so there's a lot of innovation happening around trying to, simplify this and standardize this. But these gaps still exist. And the more you go into very specific industry nuances, the more that data becomes very, very critical and very, very subjective to that particular industry. And then there's, kind of your traditional barriers in technology, commercial agreements, government factors, et cetera, that might hinder you to execute on some of these activities, right? Even if you had the forethought and interest to do this, you're going to get a bunch of tailwind and rather headwind in terms of how you actually put it into practice, right? Here's just some examples. I won't go through in detail, but an example I want to highlight here was in the energy side. Right? We all know that I would love to drive an electric car, but I have range anxiety and I also don't have a charger near me, right? So that is a technology barrier. Until the infrastructure is built up and all of that stuff is ready, I may not be able to actually invest in an electric car until some of those other things are taken care of, right? In addition to that, you're getting subsidies for, let's say, using renewable energy for a manufacturing process, for example. But oil and gas companies are currently also getting those subsidies, right? Because they're competing with China and they're competing with all these other, macro global factors. So how do you compete against that is going to be another kind of commercial challenge. And then the governments are also not, have not fully defined what exactly is sustainable and what exactly is, renewable, and those definitions are constantly changing, right? So you have to be on top of it. And as a business, you cannot really keep up with a lot of those regulatory requirements and changes on an ongoing basis. So this is kind of, again, as things settle down, this will start to get a little easier. But we are in this kind of weird transition stage where, any kind of financing decision will have to assume these as part of the change management process and as part of the ongoing tracking and KPI management. So that way, as the environment changes underneath us, your metrics and measurements and risk assessments have to change accordingly. All right. So I'll just touch upon a little bit of what's happening in the industry in general. Again, this is a very, very small sliver of what's happening, but some of the things that I've been looking at as part of what we are trying to do. Where is the industry going, right, in this world, right? So you have companies that are helping you finance carbon offsets. You have companies that are trying to help you with overall financing of projects. So if I want to install a solar farm or things like that, they can help you start to do those installations and get you financing for those installations, right? There's a couple of companies helping you with data management and data practices, so you can start to standardize and simplify your data capabilities within this sustainability world, right? Like how you do your KYC check, how you do your credit check. Now you also have to do like an ESG check, right? There's a ton of activity happening in the banking sector where they're focusing more on the consumer side and the business side to target the right customers that are interested to be part of these ecosystem. There's crowdfunding platforms that allow you as an individual to invest in green projects. So, there's a $50 million, solar farm and I want to contribute to it in some way, shape or form. I could go through some of these crowdfunding platforms and actually, put in $1,000 to be able to fund that installation. Impact analytics. So this is things about data, insights, portfolio construction, climate risk, modeling. There's space imaging. There's a ton of companies who are focused on that. Digital infrastructure, think of this as foundational data sets and blockchain-based technology that will allow you to transfer flow of funds, aggregate activity, portfolio management. There's a bunch of things that, some of these foundational infrastructure elements, that are going to be required as we scale this globally. And then there's investments, right? If I want to just create a 401k that is focused on, or an investment that's focused on green funds, there's a few companies that are trying to focus on that. So innovation is strong. It's constantly evolving. This is just like a sliver of things that, that at least I've looked at or came up in my radar. But you will probably, if you're going to dig deep into each of these, and there's more categories that I may be missing, you're probably going to see a lot more activity here. All right. And then lastly, just a little bit of plug about us. What we are trying to do is we are trying to create a sustainable finance marketplace where we are building a capability to allow organizations to go through a multi-step process of getting themselves qualified and assessed as part of the sustainability criteria, so that they can provide that criteria that many banks are starting to require. And we've created an impact performance measure that can be customized based on the bank's requirements to define how they would want to fund some of these companies. So our objective is to open up this with both the organizations and the banks, and allow them to pre-qualify themselves as part of the financing decision. And like you do your KYC check, like you do your credit check, now you do your ESG check. And we want to simplify that process for both the banks and the financial institutions. That's kind of what we are trying to build. We're still at the very early stage of the company, and we are doing a couple of pilots right now. And the goal is to kind of scale this globally and make this a little bit more of a platform long term. Okay, that's it. That's all I have. Thank you for your time, and happy to answer any questions on this.
Hemant, thank you very much. Great presentation. Tremendous amount of information out there.
Thank you.
Interesting on coming up with an assessment vehicle and trying to impact performance. I mean, every other, you think of business metrics and things, there's always going to be a how do we do, right? Whether it's shareholder engagement with like ISS or Glass Lewis, or shareholder proposals, director votes, and everything else. I found interesting your internal coordination point. I think the very first time I got exposed to this was I went to an integrated financial reporting conference, probably about 10, 12 years ago. And I remember one of the speakers asked, for a show of hands, who in the audience is from the general counsel's office?
Yeah.
And not one hand went up. So it's kind of reconciling the finance people with the legal people with the sustainability people. Right? As you go through and trying to get everybody on board. Your why important slide was incredible. I mean, whether it's mindset, value, risk management, I mean, it's all so important.
Yeah.
As we look forward.
Got it. And it's, there's a little bit of a mind shift, right? Because this is happening today. We are not, re-transforming the world, right? This is existing activity. What we are saying is you kind of basically position your existing activities to new types of activities, new types of, financing vehicles and instruments. And, some of it could be easy enough. Some of it is going to take much harder and much longer. But there are vehicles that exist today. And, if we can simplify some of the processes and some of the operational oversight that's required, I think we could potentially unlock a lot more of this activity so that we can, collectively meet this. Because, large projects are great. I think they still need to happen. But 90% of the universe are all these small mom and pop shop businesses, and how do you activate them? How do you enable them to take action? And that's the challenge today.
Yeah, no, that's a great concluding point for us for sure. And you think of sustainability, by its very nature, it's long term.
Yes,
right, and that's the whole purpose of the word is how we're all in for this for the long haul.
Exactly.
How do we work through this? So listen, Hemant Sethi, founder and CEO of Zero Circle, thanks for joining us today at One Finance World. Great comments, great presentation. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.